Welcome to the 269th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today is a discussion of the life and work of legendary disaster researcher Dennis Maletti, who passed away due to COVID-19 in January. I'll be joined by Lori Peek and Amanda Ripley. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live most weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time and many Fridays at 5:30 p.m. Korea time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, April 29th, 2021, the death toll in the United States from COVID-19 is 574,330. In India, the death toll from COVID-19 reported today is 204,832 lives lost from the disease, and that's up from 201,187 deaths reported yesterday. It's a way to bring some humanity to the numbers. I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Dennis Maletti, expert on preparing for disasters, dies at 75. This was written by Neil Genslinger, published March 19th, 2021 in the New York Times Those We've Lost series. A year ago, an opinion article in the Washington Post about the flailing American response to the emerging COVID-19 disaster quoted Dennis S. Maletti, an expert on how to prepare for and react to catastrophic events. "This might be the largest public information mess I've ever witnessed," he said. "It just breaks my heart. We know how to do emergency planning better than anyone on earth, and it's not there." 10 months later, on January 31st, Dr. Maletti himself became a COVID-19 casualty. He died of the disease at a hospital in Rancho Mirage, California, where he lived, his husband, Rick Oliver, said. He was 75. Dr. Maletti was director of the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado Boulder from 1994 to 2003. He wrote a pivotal book in the field, Disasters by Design, which was published in 1999, and was often quoted on the finer points of disaster planning and response. Reporters and government agencies sought him out for input on Hurricane Katrina, the catastrophic tsunami of 2004, even the potential impact of the temporary closing of a Los Angeles freeway. He preached the importance of consistent messaging in the face of calamity. Otherwise, he said, people can choose to follow whatever advice they like, and efforts to mitigate loss will fail. Friends and colleagues posting tributes after his death wondered how the past year might have been different had his advice been followed. Dennis Stephen Maletti was born on November 7th, 1945 in New York City to Victor and Angela Maletti. When he was an adolescent, the family moved to North Hollywood, California, where his father, a jeweler who had worked for Cartier in New York, opened his own shop. In a 2012 interview with the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, Dr. Maletti said an early movie-going experience had helped steer him toward his career path. The movie was Godzilla. "I thought I was fascinated by the monster," he said, "but in hindsight, I realized I was fascinated by the way the small herds of people moved when the monster appeared." After earning a master's degree at California State University in Los Angeles, he received his PhD in sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1975, studying under Gilbert F. White, the founder of the Natural Hazards Center. The current director of the center, Lori Peek, who studied under Dr. Maletti, said he had excelled at putting across his ideas. "Dennis was a captivating speaker," she said by email. "He didn't mind ruffling feathers because his goal was to make people think and then to encourage them to act." His insights went beyond the obvious, like having an evacuation plan for hurricane zones, to deeper questions, including how efforts to avoid hazards might backfire, A dam that controls flooding, for example, might lead to excessive development downstream, which carries future risks. Many of the nation's dams, bridges, and other structures are approaching the end of the designed life, revealing how little thought their backers and builders gave to events 50 years hence, he wrote in his book. Similarly, by providing advance warnings of severe storms, this country may well have encouraged more people to build in fragile coastal areas. Such development, in turn, makes the areas more vulnerable by destroying dunes and other protective features. It isn't really nature that's responsible for calamity, he said, but humans who don't plan properly when they settle and build. Even if the events from nature aren't getting larger, he said in a 2006 interview with Marshall Freck, producer of The Water's Edge, a documentary series on flooding, the impacts are skyrocketing because of decisions that humanity is making, and those decisions are consistent with short-term economic gains. He and Mr. Oliver, who had been together since 1967, married in 2003. Dr. Maletti is also survived by a brother, Richard. Dr. Maletti recommended that everyone envision having to survive 10 days in a desert in high heat and prepare accordingly. For me, I start my day with a cup of coffee and end it with a martini, he said in the 2012 interview. So my readiness kit includes a cowboy percolator coffee pot, Duraflame logs, a bottle of gin, a tiny ice cube maker, and an electric generator. Okay, let me introduce my guests for our discussion today. Lori Peek, who has been a guest 3 previous times on COVID Calls, I'm happy to say, is a professor in the Department of Sociology and director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She studies marginalized populations in disaster and is author of Behind the Backlash, Muslim Americans After 9/11. She's also co-editor of Displaced, Life in the Katrina Diaspora, and co-author of Children of Katrina. Lori received her PhD in sociology in 2005 from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she studied under Dennis Maletti and worked as his research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center. My second guest is Amanda Ripley. Amanda is an investigative journalist for The Atlantic and other magazines, and a New York Times bestselling author. Her newest book, released just this month, is High Conflict: Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. She also wrote The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way, about education, and The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, about the lessons of disaster survivors. In that last book, The Unthinkable, she featured Dennis Maletti, one of her favorite sources during the many years she spent covering disasters and homeland security for Time magazine in New York, Washington, and Paris. Her stories have helped Time win 2 national magazine awards. Amanda Ripley and Lori Peek, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you for having us, Scott.
So I'd like to start the way I usually do, and this is a special discussion today focusing on Dennis, coming at the end of a week in which I've talked with writers of obituaries. And so it's been a quite interesting week to talk about how we talk about death. In this case, I had the chance to talk to 2 people who knew Dennis Maletti really well. So before we turn to that, let me just get a sense of where you're calling from, how the pandemic is looking there, what the vaccination situation may be looking like there today. Amanda, can I start with you, please?
Sure. So I am in Washington, D.C., where about a third of the people here have received at least 1 shot. I have been fortunate to receive 2 at this point, so I'm fully vaccinated and very grateful. The numbers have been steadily going down here. So things are starting to slowly, very almost imperceptible to the human eye, slowly open up a bit.
And in terms of things being open, restaurants, but also more important things like schools and the museums there in DC, are things getting back to some level of operating?
It is frustratingly slow, in my opinion. The Smithsonian museums are supposed to reopen in May. The National Zoo has been closed for most of this pandemic, even though it's outside and it's free and it's one thing that families can do even when they're strapped for cash. So it's been frustrating. The school system is haltingly opening, but again, more slowly than I'd like. But it's inch by inch, as my mother-in-law says, inch by inch. We'll get there.
Lori, it's good to see you again, and welcome back to COVID Calls. Amanda's describing a situation of inch by inch progress where she is. How's it looking in Boulder?
Yeah, and Scott, it's so good to see you, and really an honor to be here with Amanda as well. And yeah, so thank you for having us, and thank you for always asking with this question. So in Boulder, we are right now, I just looked after hearing Amanda, 42% of eligible adults are vaccinated in Boulder County, and 62% have had one shot. And so we are on an upswing, and it feels like that. I mean, it really, people are out, they're on the road, people are, biking, hiking, doing all the things that people do here in Boulder. And at the university, they actually announced this week that they are going to require all students, staff, and faculty to be vaccinated in advance of our return to classes in the fall. And they are anticipating that about 70% of our classes will be in person. And so that was sort of the big news from where I spend most of my life at the university that was released this week. And so that really gave a lot of hope to know that there is going to be that requirement around the vaccine for thinking about the possibility of actually returning to the core of our educational mission.
That has such a huge impact. I mean, I know in private universities had come out early with that announcement that they were going to do that, but I haven't heard of many publics or one as large as where you are making that announcement. So that's quite something.
Yeah, the University of Colorado system, 4 campuses, over 60,000 students, over 40,000 staff. And even at the beginning of this week, it wasn't clear to me that they were going to make that requirement, but I understand that our governor was very supportive of this. So from the top of the state on down. And so it will be really interesting to see how other universities across the nation, private and public, really follow or don't follow suit in this regard.
There have been so many convergences of disaster in this past year, and I should ask you about how things are in Boulder after the mass shooting, Lori. It was such devastating news to see. In the middle of such a devastating period, how is everyone doing there?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. That's right. On March 22nd, 10 people perished in the King Soopers shooting here. And I think it's quite variable, as with everything. It was another trauma on top of many other traumas that have been unfolding for quite some time. And so, I can't speak for how everybody is doing, but I would definitely say that the community, there have been a lot of resources that have been made available. There have been a lot of, even during this time of distance, the entire community was invited to go outside and observe a moment of silence. And so sort of the theme of the pandemic, how do we come together when we're apart, continued to be a theme in the response to that disaster as well.
Well, let's turn to some discussion of Dennis Mileti. I never had the chance to know him, although there was a point in my career in which I carried a copy of Disasters by Design. I was just remembering this last night. I just carried it around, and historians do that kind of thing. His work has meant a lot to me, but I never had the chance to really get to know him. Lori, and so I'd like to hear from both of you just about Dennis as a person. And Lori, I'm going to start with you on that.
Nice. Thank you for that. And just thank you for doing this show on Dennis. I'm such a believer that people are never really gone as long as we keep speaking their name and sharing what we learn from them. And so I'm just really excited to be here to talk about Dennis. And so I actually met Dennis when I was applying to graduate programs. I lived up in Fort Collins. I did a master's at Colorado State, and I wanted to go to CU Boulder for my PhD. And so I, out of the blue, emailed Dennis because he was the chair of the Department of Sociology and said, can I come and meet with you and talk about the program? And he made time. He made a 30-minute meeting with me, and I will never forget it. I think everybody who's met Dennis Mileti would agree. He is an unforgettable person. And I just remember I was sitting in his office in Ketchum Arts and Sciences on the University of Colorado campus, I mean, I would have been 21 years old, and I was just transfixed. And I thought, this is the person who I want to work with. And, and so I sat there, I listened to him. He told me all about the program. And then I was fortunate to get accepted into the program. And I ended up being hired the summer before I started to be a research assistant at the Natural Hazard Center. And so Dennis was just, from the day I walked into that center, he's a force of nature. And he just imprinted so much on my mind and on my heart, and was such a special person. And so that was how I came to know him. And the question of what was he like? I mean, again, unforgettable. He was funny. He was so smart. I mean, so smart, meticulous in everything that he did. Dennis kept a paper calendar, an 8x10 paper calendar his whole life, that he wrote everything in pencil. He scheduled to the minute everything that he did, because he wanted to make every minute count. And I think that was something about Dennis's life, that he did make every minute count through his research. When he was researching, he was researching. When he was teaching 400 students in Intro to Sociology, he was teaching 400 students with his whole being. When he was giving a lecture to 10 emergency managers or 1,000, he was 100% there with you. And he was just fully present in everything that he did. And I think I will stop there, because I know Amanda has so much to share about coming to know Dennis too. But I will say this, that Amanda will never remember this, but I met Amanda at the Natural Hazards Workshop, and I actually sat like one chair away from her, and I knew she was this journalist from Time who had come to the workshop I believe Dennis, it was either Dennis or Kathleen, had invited Amanda, and then Amanda went on to write the extraordinary book, The Unthinkable, which I read on an airplane, which I don't know if I would recommend, but I read The Unthinkable, and then I got to the chapter with Dennis in it, and I was like, oh my goodness. And so years later, when I finally got to meet Amanda, really meet Amanda and come to know her. And so anyway, Scott, just thank you for bringing us together and letting us both talk about how we came to meet this extraordinary man.
Thanks, Lori. I'm going to bring Amanda in, and I love your description of the hazards meeting, and it is a bit like that. It's like, somebody new is here, somebody interesting is here. Who is that? And Amanda, I know you met Dennis. Maybe you met him in your reporting before you were working on the book, The Unthinkable. I'm not sure, but that's the context in which you met him. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to meet him and to work with him as a person who was a source for you, and then I guess became a friend.
Yeah, it's so nice to just hear Lori talk about Dennis. Like her joy in him, the memory of him is like infectious. I don't know if you can sense that, but I really feel like he's almost here with us, just listening to Lori talk about him. So I was a reporter covering terrorism, disasters for Time Magazine, and somehow found out that there was this place where they actually study these things. I had no idea. And I was like, wow. And they have a conference, and it's supposedly really good. And so somehow convinced my editor to send me there. And in July of 2006, I think that was the first one I went to, but may not have been. But I just remember vividly that Dennis appeared at a panel that was titled Risk-Wise Behavior. And there were about, 440 people there listening. Dennis went last. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, which he often wore. And he was the only one who didn't have a PowerPoint, I remember. And he just got up and started preaching, basically. So he was like a reporter's dream, because he used emotion. He was clear. He wasn't afraid to say things that were provocative, but true. And he said, how many people do you need to see pounding through their roofs before we tell them how high the floodwaters can be, how hard the ground can shake? How many citizens must die to get us to do it? If you can't create the political will, do it anyway, he said. And I remember the crowd went crazy because, it was like, it's easy in these events to kind of get into this droning talk about data and PowerPoints and so on, caveats and, the known knowns and the unknowns. And Dennis just kind of cut to the chase. And we had lunch after that next to Boulder Creek And he just was so good at talking in a way that regular people could understand and relate to, and sort of unafraid to do that, he was an interesting kind of personality, because on the one hand, like a lot of disaster researchers I've met, he was sort of like a low level, constant sense of frustration, right? Because, these things keep happening over and over,
Yeah.
and people don't always, listen. And yet also at the same time, simultaneously, he had this optimism, this like real deep faith that we could do better, that we will do better. Whereas I find it's easy for me, and this is not something I'm proud of, but I get sort of jaded after I've said the same thing, when I have a book come out or whatever, and I say the same thing like 1,000 times. I feel like, okay, I've done what I can do. I'm done here. You know what I mean? Like I can't. And Dennis never gave up on the American public. He never was annoyed by my dumb questions. There was a lot I didn't know. There's still a lot I don't know. And I never felt like he was judging me for that. He was just, he recognized that to get to millions of Americans, he had to go through me, or at least that was one way to do it. And he really felt like he was an ally, like he was a truth teller, like he could speak truth to power. And I always really enjoyed our conversations on top of that. So, and he had a good sense of humor, because I remember in the book, The Unthinkable, I wrote that, after Dennis says something particularly provocative, he laughs with a loud bark, showing off unnaturally white, straight teeth. And I remember I saw him at the next conference after the book came out, and I was a little nervous about how that was going to go over. And he's like, "Oh yeah, you're the one who wrote about my teeth." Like I saw him in like a buffet line or something. And I was like, "That's right." He goes, "How you doing?" Like he was just he remembered it. I don't know how he really felt, but it didn't slow him down, because, the mission was more important than his vanity, I guess, in this case. But he had a sense of humor about it, as far as I know. I mean, Lori, you may know differently. You knew him much better than I did. But.
Let me just follow up on one thing you said, Amanda, because I think it's something that the disaster researchers I know really, really work hard at, which is that they are carrying with them a lot of social science knowledge, really complicated studies in many cases around risk communication, let's say. And then they get the chance to talk to somebody who is a translator for a broader audience. And I think for a lot of disaster researchers, that's a nerve-wracking experience. How do I find the right details? How do I point, and without doing what we do as researchers, like, well, here's 6 studies for you to go and look at. Some journalists might do that, but if you're on deadline, you might not have time to do that. So could you say a little bit more about those interactions with him as a sort of a translator of a body of research, the kinds of details he might point out to you, or the ways that he would explain that often quite esoteric and complicated research, so that it could then turn into facts that you could put in a story?
I think there were 3 important things that he did. The first is he told stories. He was a natural storyteller, so he understood the importance of, even if it's not a big story, telling a story of some project he recently worked on, or a dam here, or a nuclear power plant investigation there, and he understood that you could go across different hazards in that way, and it was okay that audiences often appreciate analogy. And so that was one thing. The other thing was that it could be, by the time, I was interviewing Dennis, he was no longer sort of in charge, I believe, at the Hazard Center. So I don't know if that liberated him, Lori. I'd be curious what you think, but he didn't seem that worried about whether he got in trouble. And maybe that was the time that we were living in. Maybe that was his role. Maybe that was just his personality. I mean, there are people who are just kind of let things roll. But that also was super important. Like, you have to take some risk. You have to just be willing to put it out there and not overthink it. And it's sort of like he seemed to understand that there's a lot of noise out there, and you're not going to be able to get every, footnote just right in the mainstream media, right? And so it's okay. You don't have to like perfect it. it's like the hurly burly of the conversation, and you're not, it's a constant conversation. So you don't have to get everything just right and caveat it 8 ways and talk to me on background or off the record and then come back. And I mean, you can do that, but it just makes it much less likely that it's going to be in the story, and just much less memorable for the audience. And the third thing that he did was he let his conviction shine through. So even when what he was talking about was objectively a little in the weeds sometimes, that passion underneath it, like I was describing from that panel, right? That gets you a long way, and makes it, so that the story writes itself, because he's giving you some emotion in his quote, which is authentic. I mean, you don't want to make it up, right? But then, you can kind of tolerate some analysis of different text messaging devices or things that Dennis used to get really excited about. Right. And because the passion is driving it.
Lori, just to bring you back in to react to anything Amanda said, and then we also want to get a sort of a sense for people who may not be as familiar with his work, sort of like how Dennis got started and what were some of the key research areas that he was interested in. And Patrick Roberts, thanks for listening. Patrick, it's good to see you here. Patrick asked the same question: how did Dennis Mileti come to study disasters? So anything you want to take in those areas?
Absolutely. And Amanda, I think that is such a beautiful synthesis of Dennis's strengths as a communicator. And I think you are right that after he retired from CU and from the Natural Hazard Center, that he that maybe there was just a little bit of liberation that comes from that, right? But I think that, right, he was all that you said. I mean, he was always a storyteller. He was always a truth teller, and he always spoke about things that mattered. And I remember one time Dennis told me that Gilbert White, who's the founder of our center and was one of Dennis's mentors, that Gilbert had said one time to Dennis, and this had a profound influence on Dennis, that Gilbert had said, whenever you go to give a talk, that is a chance to influence people to do the right thing. And I think that Dennis carried that with him his whole life, and he passed those words on to me. And I thought, once he shared that, you stop being scared, because it's no longer about you. It's not about you at all. It's about what you're trying to put into the world and what that possibility can be. And when you recognize what you're sharing is literally a matter of life and death. And I think he took that with him everywhere. That was always so clear in what he was speaking about as well. And so, so thank you for that. And I love Patrick's question about what led Dennis to study disasters. And so I think there were so many things that Dennis used to always talk about. So he was born in New York City. I always identified as a New Yorker, but when he was a boy, his family actually moved to California. And so all of a sudden, Dennis is this young boy in earthquake country, comes to be very aware of earthquakes, but he also used to tell stories about how Godzilla movies really influenced him and sort of his imagination and so forth. And so Dennis had this interest and fascination with disasters. But when he came to the University of Colorado Boulder, where he did his PhD in sociology, Dennis actually was hired by Gilbert to be one of the students who worked on the first assessment of natural hazards in the United States. And so Dennis's master's work in California was definitely connected to disasters as well. And that was part of what brought him to the University of Colorado Boulder. But definitely his interest and his expertise was solidified during his PhD work, and especially working with Gilbert on that first assessment. And as far as his development of the expertise in risk communication, Dennis also told a great story about this, this is, I don't know if people could actually see us, Scott, but this is, you talk about carrying around books. So this is the first assessment, and this is the second assessment that Dennis led. And the first assessment that Gilbert led, Dennis used to tell this story about how he was in the room, the meeting with all the grad students. Mike Lindell was there, John Sorensen, all of these other leading hazards researchers who worked on the first assessment. And Gilbert, I guess, pointed to a bookshelf, which at that time held everything that had been written on risk communication. And Gilbert told Dennis, okay, you're going to read all of that and you're going to do the section on risk communication. And later, Dennis told me, how funny it was to him, because at the time as a grad student, he thought, I'll never be able to read all of that. It was literally like one library shelf. And now, of course, the risk communication literature would fill multiple libraries. And so, but at the time, and that's what Dennis did. He read everything on risk communication, and that ended up becoming his first book and setting planting the seeds for what became an extraordinary career in that area. So Patrick, I hope that answers your question a little bit and does it justice.
I can remember visiting the first time I visited the Natural Hazards Center, and Kathleen Tierney was the director. And Kathleen was so generous to me. I mean, I was working on a PhD dissertation, and she took time, and I'll never forget. I mean, it was just sort of the spirit of the place that I guess Gilbert had established, and that others, including Dennis, had passed along, that it had this openness to people coming from different disciplines who were interested in what they did there. And we sat on the porch and talked, and then rummaging through, the library there and pulling things out, and they encouraged me to take things, and they actually gave me a copy, sort of loaned me indefinitely a copy of that first assessment. And I remember sitting and reading it and just having that same experience, you're describing about Dennis, Lori, is like, how do they draw together all of this work to make out of these many disparate things something that started to look like a field by the 1970s? And I think that's something we probably don't pay enough attention to, talking about how diverse a field disciplinarily disaster research actually is, and to begin to draw it into something that could bring people to a conference, that could be coherent, and then could begin to try to influence policy, which is what Gilbert wanted to do, and Dennis and others. That was a real achievement. 20 years later, 30 years later, Dennis took the lead on the Disasters by Design project. Let's talk about that a little bit for a second. I don't know, Lori, let me bring you in first, and then Amanda, I'll bring you back in, just to talk a little bit about that intervening period of time, but also how important that 1999 book has been.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's right. The first assessment, which was led by Gilbert White, eminent geographer, and Gene Haas, a sociologist, that was published in 1975. And then the second assessment, what we call the second assessment, but Disasters by Design is the published name of the book. The second assessment was published in 1999. And Dennis had actually come back to the University of Colorado Boulder, I believe, in 1994 is when he became the director of the Hazard Center. So Dennis was the director of the Hazard Center from 1994 to 2003. And so when Dennis came back to the University of Colorado Boulder, the second assessment was one of his key projects that he was planning on working on. And so he actually brought together, he did a different model. So when Gilbert led the first assessment, it really was teams of graduate students, predominantly at the Natural Hazard Center and at the University of Colorado Boulder, who were working with Dennis or with Gilbert on that first assessment. But Dennis took a different approach where he also brought in many graduate students from the University of Colorado Boulder, like Alice Fothergill, Eve Passerini, Lynn Wright, Eve Grenfest, and others. So Dennis also brought in many graduate students, but he also brought together over 130 of the nation's leading hazards and disaster experts who contributed to the second assessment. And so he had various working groups that were working together on the second assessment, and then also multiple other books were produced as part of the second assessment. So Howard Kunrather led one, Susan Cutter led another, Kathleen Tierney, Mike Lindell, and Ron Perry led another. And so there were several additional books that came out of the second assessment project because it was such a major undertaking. And then the National Academies under the Joseph Henry Press published all of those books. And so, so that was a little bit about the process of the second assessment. And I can say I started graduate school in 1999 at Boulder right after the second assessment had been published. And so Dennis was on an airplane every single week because Disasters by Design had just come out, and he was across the country, around the world, trying to convey the message of sustainable hazards mitigation. If we are ever going to turn the tide of rising disaster losses, that really engaging in sustainable hazards mitigation and not putting off future losses for future generations to deal with, instead dealing with it now, was at the heart of the recommendation for the second assessment. And to use Amanda's word, talk about conviction. Dennis, I mean, that was his conviction. How can we do something about the disasters that we are designing today that are going to unfold tomorrow and years from now? And so, so that's a little backstory on the second assessment. Thanks, Scott.
What remarkable team efforts. And then to imagine Dennis sort of on the road, touring the record, touring the book, and then taking, again, sort of translating this complicated work of many teams of researchers into messages that could then be put into place by practitioner communities or could have uptake into the policy process or in journalism. Thanks for going into that detail, Lori. Just want to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're having a special COVID Calls discussion today of the life and work of disaster researcher Dennis Mileti, who died earlier this year of COVID-19. I'm talking with Amanda Ripley and Lori Peek. Amanda, just turning back to you and talking a little bit about the work you gave. I loved your description of how you sort of found disaster research. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some of the concepts that you found most provocative, maybe misunderstood ideas that you then went on to explain in your book, The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why. What did you find compelling about the research?
I think so often in journalism, we cover each disaster as if it's never happened before. And it's often different people covering them, right? So wasn't really a beat per se. I ended up sort of creating a beat at time, which I was able to do thanks to my editors at the time, and we had the resources to do it. But that was really important because you start to see how much of this was predicted, warned about, studied, modeled, simulated, and how similar human behavior is across really different disasters, right? Which I don't think is well understood in the sort of among lay people. And so that to me was really interesting. And what I found was, after 9/11, I did a lot of sort of traditional stories, obviously, about that disaster. And at least I kind of reached a wall, because you do the stories of sadness and loss, very important. You do the stories of blame and accountability, also important. And then, what else? Like, it just felt like there had to be more. And what I found anecdotally was just every survivor I was interviewing had things that had surprised them about the experience, about what it felt like physically, emotionally, socially, to evacuate the Trade Center, or in other disasters, hurricanes, how they made the decision to evacuate or not evacuate. And there were really specific things, many of them hopeful, that they wanted people to know. But none of that naturally made its way into our stories. And it certainly didn't come up in your average, Homeland Security hearing on Capitol Hill. And it just seemed like, for me, a way to take these stories, which were so heavy and hard to carry, and turn them, at least in some way, towards the future and try to make them useful, which, most disaster survivors I had spent time with really wanted to do. So it didn't feel quite as extractive or exploitive as some of the other stories we do. So it was, in a way, my coping device for the level of sort of despair that you feel if you just, to write a story like that and do it well. I think you have to feel it on some level, and you just can't keep doing that indefinitely. You eventually sort of wall yourself off from feeling it, or which makes the story worse, or or you stop doing it, I think, or you are traumatized. So those are your choices. So to me, Dennis was really an important teacher for me as well, because he always centered people. That was really different from a lot of other research and preparedness conversations I had observed. Was, you can get really in the weeds, and I know it's important to talk about, all hazards and communication devices and all these things, but I think the percentage that we talk about people is still a little low. And Dennis helped me see that everything was about people. He got that viscerally. And even though he would happily get in the weeds, he loved data. There was still a sense that, look, we got to deal with people the way they're wired, he used to say, right? And this is the way we are. And you also, he'd say things like, he had like certain catchphrases, which I'm sure Lori, you will recognize, but he'd say things like, you don't have to scare people to death to get them to do what you need them to do. The science is really clear on that. He would always reference the science, which I enjoyed. And he was right? So having those phrases in his pocket was very helpful, I think, for those kinds of interviews because it's not easy, right, to move between academia and clinicians and, just dilettante journalists like myself. So the fact that he could do that meant he was sort of trilingual. And that's really, really valuable.
Just to highlight something you said there, which I think is really important to Amanda, is the tension of journalism that's following disasters as events in the moment, on deadline, and the fact that also there are not a lot of journalists who have the disaster beat, whatever that may be, for whatever region they're living in. To find someone like yourself who could then turn that into an ongoing set of stories and eventually a book, and more work, that then begins to draw those connections across disasters and across time. I mean, disasters by design, disasters as a process, disasters in society. That's really important. And so I think, him spotting you and working that relationship as an intellectual relationship is also really important and doesn't get enough attention, I don't think. I wonder if any reaction to that, Amanda, but also maybe some hope that can become more consistent in our media space. I mean, particularly with COVID on our minds. I'm really worried that, as often happens, the reporting, it does what it has to do. It follows the breaking news, but then where are we a year or 5 years later when we need to have followed those stories across time?
Right, because the best research, as you both know, will come out in like 3 years. I mean, way after the news media has moved on, but that research is really important and really interesting. So you really have to have relationships, which I think Dennis valued, so that that was one thing with Katrina, because I had met Lori and Dennis and other people from the coming to the Hazard Center. When Katrina happened, we knew who to call right away. And it made the reporting so much richer and better. And we knew that there were reams and reams of studies and research and analysis that we could draw from to kind of widen the lens on the story. So it's not just about the mayor of New Orleans failed to call a mandatory evacuation. I mean, that's important, right? And that is a pattern, right? That people in authority often underestimate the public in disasters and are afraid of panic and other things. So seeing that pattern makes the story much more useful and interesting. But you have to have those relationships, just like with emergency response, the relationships have to predate the incident. So it's hard now because especially local print news is so decimated, but having those relationships with local TV people, I think, is a great idea, and really building those relationships in advance, offering them visuals. They're always hungry for visuals, and really once we can, going out to lunch with them before. And all you have to do is say you can offer them an exclusive on some new research. Like, you don't really have to say anything else. And then
okay, good tip. Everybody, write that down.
Yeah. And do it, give it to them first. And, I know that can be tricky with peer review. Well, as Dennis would say, do it anyway, right? So you can figure it out. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be the last word. They're going to give you like 3 minutes. I mean, it's, so don't overthink it, but have the relationship, offer them some exclusivity, which works well with their boss, and have that relationship so they can call you when something that will seem to the layperson to be unrelated happens. They will know that actually it's not new. And so that's important, I think.
The community of the Hazards Center and Disaster Research, which I think it's a big tent of researchers and people who are connected to that world, and journalists as well as policymakers, there's been a lot of outpouring about Dennis Milletti's death. And Lori, at the Hazard Center on their site, I'm just going to put the link up here. There's a series of tributes. It's pretty overwhelming, and I hope people will take some time to look at those. I'm going to actually just read one by Diane Smith, who worked at the Natural Hazard Center, and I met her when I first made my first trip out there. I'm just going to read this. "Dennis was more than just a wonderful boss," she wrote, "and the best person I've ever worked for. I so enjoyed his integrity and honesty in dealing with all levels of people. He was a giant in the hazards community and was respected and loved by all. Many days he would come in running with feet barely touching the floor on a busy day. He not only directed the Natural Hazard Center with grace and honor, but also ran the challenging department of sociology. He learned from the best, Gilbert White, and he always made time to talk with you, and he listened intently and caringly, making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. Like all that knew Dennis, I just loved him, and he will be dearly missed. My heartfelt sympathy and prayers to Rick." That was written by Diane Smith at the Natural Hazard Center. Lori, can you talk a little bit about the process of pulling these tributes together and what that has been like?
Yeah, absolutely. And Diane was the lead administrative assistant at the center for many years and was there when I was a graduate student, and just she used to love it. Dennis used to always say to her, "Treat me like I'm a fourth grader and tell me what to do." And so he would come back from trips, and Dennis had this thing where he kept all of his receipts organized in an envelope, and that was of course like a dream, because he would come in and hand it to Diane, and he did love her and she loved him, and he was just so good to all of us. And thank you for reading that, Scott. You are right, it is one of many tributes that is up on the Hazard Center website. So after Dennis passed away, I had talked to Rick, his truly lifelong partner, and we decided to put the tribute page up on the Hazard Center website so other people from different dimensions of Dennis's life would have a chance to share their memories of him. And that is what people have done. His former graduate student RAs and teaching assistants, his former colleagues in sociology, his own friends from graduate school, colleagues who he worked with over the years from federal agencies, academic institutions, private sector, just the gamut of people have written in. And there have also been many people who wrote in who never met Dennis, like never really met him, but they heard him speak. And they talked about what an influence that it had on his life. And so just thanks for calling this out and sharing the link, Scott, because I hope if there's anybody out there listening who knew Dennis who hasn't shared their story yet, we would be so honored and so pleased if you would put that up there so we could have it as part of the archive. But also I know it's meant a lot to Rick to be able to just read those tributes and to have access to them. And so we would love to hear from even more people who Dennis touched and influenced through the Milletti effect. And so we would love that very much. And also just it's kind of like salve for the soul to be able to go up there and to read those words. So thank you.
I was, again, just reading those yesterday and just thinking we should all strive to work in such a way that you would have so many people comment. And a lot of times, like in Diane's, there'll be a line that says, obviously a brilliant guy. But the rest of it is just about how he carried himself in the world. And I think for academics who are often under such pressure to produce, career-defining work, path-defining work, and of course, it's tense and it's competitive, and we have to do that. But those other pieces are the ones that people write about. And I hope people will go and spend some time with those tributes. And Lori, they're still open. People can still contribute.
Yes, we have a forum that's up there that people can contribute to. And I just wanted to again, Scott, thank you for reading them, and a shout out to Amanda, because before she wrote her really extraordinary piece in the Washington Post that was shared far and wide across the hazards community, I know Amanda went, as an expert journalist, went and read many of those as well. And so, yeah, people can absolutely still contribute in there as we post, sort of every week. Jeffrey at the Hazard Center posts the newest tributes up there. So we'll get them live very soon if you post a new one.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, tribute to Dennis Mileti with Lori Peek and Amanda Ripley. Amanda, Lori mentioned this op-ed that you published earlier in the year after Dennis died in the Washington Post. And in there, you have this extraordinary line. You say, when I last spoke to Dennis Mileti, one of the world's leading experts on how humans behave in disasters, he told me he was frightened. And that's in the context of COVID-19. What was he frightened of?
When I heard that Dennis had died, the first thing I did was go look back at my notes, because I had reached out to him. I hadn't talked to him in years because I'd been covering other things. And, I reached out to him because I was writing, obviously, about COVID for the Post and trying to be useful. And so we had talked very early in the pandemic. I mean, really like the first week. And he was really distressed. Like I had never heard him be this distressed. And that line he said about him being scared, I remember really reacting to that internally. Like I didn't want to hear that at that point. As Dennis taught me, the first phase most of us go through in a disaster is some level of denial. And I think I was in that phase. I like to think that somehow I'm different and I could skip that phase, but no. So he said to me, when I stop thinking and just lay in the quiet, I get really scared. And it's the lack of knowledge. It's the lack of planning. He said he was particularly upset. I mean, there were some states that he called out and praised, but at that point, early on, he was particularly upset with the feds. He said the feds are just an embarrassment. They should turn them off. Here, I think he's talking about politicals, like politicians. Pull the plug. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. We have people saying it will be over soon and other people saying it could be months. That gives the public the ability to pick the answer they like, which is the number one no-no in public messaging. Of course, easier said than done looking back on it, right? We really didn't know what we didn't know, but that's often true. So anyway, he did also say that he wasn't scared of dying of COVID. He said that I think what he was scared of was for the country, and then he said, of course, I don't believe I'm going to get it and die because I'm a human and I process risk like anyone else. So even there, he was aware of his own risk calculus and his own blind spots. And, but that really stayed with me, and it bothered me so much, I'm not more subconsciously, I think, that I didn't use it in the piece. I used other things he said, which were really powerful. But it was only when I did the second piece after he died where I included that line, because I just think I wasn't ready to hear it, because Dennis had never seemed scared to me. So it was unsettling, and he turned out, to be right.
Almost up on time in our discussion today about Dennis Mileti. Just wanted to give each of my guests a chance if there's any final things you wanted to say about him or think about his legacy going forward. Amanda, your thoughts on that?
I'm just very grateful that I got to know him when I did, and that he was so open and honest and unafraid in talking to a reporter. There's lots of good reasons not to trust reporters. But he never seemed too worried about whether, he wanted me to get it right. That was for sure. But I felt like I could always redeem myself. And the mission was bigger than me or than him. And that really is inspiring to me.
Lori, I'm going to give you the last word in this discussion of Dennis Milletti today.
Thank you. And this has just been really moving. So I guess I just say about Dennis's legacy that obviously, I mean, he leaves behind a tremendous body of written work, multiple books, but well over 100 journal articles. So much written material that continues to be so widely cited in our field. And so there's obviously that piece of his legacy, but I think you picked up, Scott, on it was so much more than that, than what he's leaving behind with the written word. It's also his spoken word and how he influenced truly countless people through his interviews, his speeches, his way of being interactionally and so forth. And then as his former student, I mean, what he's left behind in terms of all of the students that he taught and mentored over the years and how committed he was to us. I think is going to be another big part of his legacy. And I'm so thankful for what he left behind. And I remember the last time I saw him in person was February of 2020. And I think something that always struck me about Dennis, because he had this, even though he was sort of larger than life, he also had this humility about him. And he would pick me up at the airport and he was driving me and he said, "Lori, people don't know, I'm just a big teddy bear." And then he went on to say, he said, people don't realize, that that he was just sort of like reflecting on his life. And he said, "I'm still like that 12-year-old boy that I can't believe people listen to me." And, and he said, and that was, I think, part of his legacy too, of wanting to make sure that other people would be listened to and really be heard in this field. And he always had to carry that belief with him. So may we all do that.
You can catch COVID calls weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. Hope you'll go back and take a look at the other calls from this week and my interviews with Paige Cornwell and Dan Waken and Chris Majerian talking about obituary writing. And I want to thank my guests for today, talking about the life and legacy of disaster researcher Dennis Milletti, Amanda Ripley, and Lori Peek. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you on Monday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern time.